All right, I hope we have YouTube up and running again. And let me just back up now and tell you that I'm going to conclude today's rumination by sharing with you the excerpt of a sikha, of a talk that the Rebbe delivered on the last day of Pesach in the year 1960. He began this particular talk by emphasizing many of the things that we've touched upon. He talked about the idea that Pesach is a season of liberation. It's a time in which we focus on freedom. The Passover night is about the narrative of liberation and freedom of Geula. And as such, it's hard to see how Maror fits into this milieu. The Rebbe says, let's talk about Pesach. Pesach is a paradigm of freedom or of luxury. The Pesach is supposed to be eaten, tzli esh, well, fire roasted. What's called in the syntax of the Talmud derech gedula, in a rich, luxurious way. The truth is that the Pesach, the original korban Pesach, represented the greatest act of liberation. The Jewish people being ready to defy their taskmasters. At that time, the Egyptians worshipped animals, including the sheep. By taking the very idol or deity of their taskmasters and defying them by slaughtering it to honor Hashem, the Israelites were able to realize freedom. Pesach becomes an act of defiance that catalyzes the exodus, the redemption itself. Matzah, well, the notion of matzah was miraculous food. Hashem didn't allow the matzah to rise the next morning. And even if you speak about the lachma anya, the bread of poverty, the achola havasana that our ancestors ate out of the Mitzrayim, this too, my dear friends, is related to some kind of freedom. Hey, at least they got to eat. But Maror? Maror is bitter herbs. Maror seems to have no value in and of itself. In what way does it serve as a contribution for freedom, liberation, or expression of the human spirit? The Rebbe said that it's interesting to note that the korban Pesach was only applicable in the time when the Beis Hamikdash stood. Matzah is a mitzvah that we continue to observe even in our exilic times. Maror, it's only a rabbinic ordination. It's something they enacted as a zecher, as a memory for the way things used to be. The Rebbe suggests something very interesting. There is copious talk in the writings of the sages, the Talmudic sages, about the distinction between a biblical mitzvah and a rabbinic mitzvah. A mitzvah is a convention through which we're able to develop and nurture a more powerful relationship with God. When we perform a biblical mitzvah, the act of self is a thing of sanctity. It's what contains the energy of our relationship. It is necessarily about the object. Rabbinic mitzvahs aren't necessarily same. There it's much less about the object, but more about the subject, the person who's doing the mitzvah. It's the effort that the person expends that's most valuable. It's the actions that we take rather than the object that is created. And so the Rebbe says this: in the time when the Beit HaMikdash stood, it was possible to experience the profoundest closeness to Hashem. You know that the word korban is an idiom or permutation of the word kiruv, which means closeness? In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, people could experience higher consciousness. When they would come to the Holy Temple, they would not only be seen by God, but in fact, they themselves were able to see, if you will, or apprehend a higher level of divine truth. For some, it evolved into actual prophecy, but for all, there was higher consciousness And as such, even the bitter things in life were swept up in higher consciousness. The bitterness faded away. You could see the essence, the core goodness that was in everything. The Rebbe says that's why the Maror, the bitter things, were eaten together with the korban Pesach. When you were bringing a korban from the terminology closeness, kiruv, even bitter things became sweet. You're able to see past the facade of the world as we know it. You're able to recognize and appreciate the profound presence of the Creator in every iota of existence. No Beis Hamikdash. You can't do that with Maror anymore. The Maror remains bitter. And so, that's with regard to the bitterness itself. Bitter is bad. But with regard to the person who deals with bitterness, the idea of a rabbinic mitzvah, it's about the person's actions taken. When you deal with a bitter experience, you oftentimes emerge elevated, inspired, and achieve a greater sense of joy, a sweetness about life. The bitterness brings us there. No, bitter in and of itself isn't good, but it can lead us into something good. The Rebbe said there are people who kvetch and complain and say, well, if God wanted us to study Torah and to do mitzvot, why did He make it so difficult? And the answer is that by overcoming those difficulties, we are able to reach the highest and the greatest levels of closeness to Hashem. We can't eat a korban today. We don't have the privilege of that closeness. However, we do have the ability, even in our day and age, to deal or contend with bitterness, not by making it sweet. The Maror tastes lousy. However, through it we can become elevated. Yeah. The Maror is never something that really stands on its own. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, it was a mitzvah that could be experienced in the sweetest of ways because it was eaten together with the korban. And when we have no Beit HaMikdash, the Maror doesn't stand on its own. It's a rabbinic mitzvah. It's the actions that we need to take that make all the difference. In other words, the idea of the Maror enables us to recognize, at least theoretically, in our mind's eye, that everything that Hashem does for us is actually kindness. That all of the difficulties, the travails and experiences we have are all designed so that we will be all that we can be. That you can be the best we possible. Maror is indeed one of the three things, the three components, that is critically important in our Passover journey of liberation. Not because Maror has value in and of itself, but because Maror becomes a springboard to true growth. A person can fulfill the mitzvah of korban Pesach without Maror. We mentioned that earlier. In other words, you can evoke divine compassion through a korban itself. But rachamim rabim, which the Tzemach Tzedek spoke of, the great mercies, that can only be achieved when we have the notion of the difficulty before us. Do you know what happens when life is sweet, easy, and cushy? We don't accomplish that much. The Talmud says that when a person doesn't work for his bread, it's bread of shame. Past that shame is when we earned it and overcame a challenge. Yes, Hashem does challenge us and vex us, but ultimately, it's all for our good. Pesach is a time in which we experience liberation by coming to the realization that the bitterness in life has purpose too. And it's up to us to use that as a springboard for greater growth. as opportunities. And that's why it's a critical and extremely important foundational point, one of 3 essentials in our Passover narrative. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, in truth, can only be experienced in the totality of the 3. In today's day and age, appreciate Yitzchak. Yitzchak, our sages tell us, his life's lessons will only be fully appreciated when Mashiach comes. Maharal says the Maror corresponds to Yitzchak. Indeed, the bitterness of our long and difficult exile will only be appreciated, will only be understood once Mashiach finally comes. But the message that Maror brings in the milieu of the Pesach Seder is keep on moving forward. Just to inundate and overwhelm you. Use them as catalysts and springboards for greater growth, for that is ultimately the true purpose. And when we serve Hashem in that fashion, that enables us to be able to experience not the naturally sweet taste, but the sweetened reality, or the bittersweet reality that comes out of the difficulty of Golus, of which is born Geula, redemption, and Cherus, true freedom. Hashem should give us the wisdom, the intuition, and the courage to face our challenges and our of faith with a sense of awareness that all of this is for a higher purpose, that we should be able to find joy in the life that Hashem gives us, although we aren't satisfied with the realities we live with today. And then, hopefully, this will spirit us across the finish line so that besimcha uvetuv levav, with a deep sense of dissatisfaction with galut, but with a sense of inner fulfillment, we will be able to welcome the coming of Mashiach b'mheira u'biyameinu amen. Thanks so much for joining today.